Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, so now game two's pretty much done. So every matchup in the playoffs so far, we are done with at least the first couple of games. So we're gonna get into them right now. So obviously the first one, I think, is kind of the big story. Houston Rockets evening up the series 109-94. But obviously it also came at a cost for Golden State. Jimmy Butler gets hurt in the first half, only plays 8 minutes, has a pelvic contusion, makes the free throw, I think, or makes one of two, then leaves the game kind of gingerly, walks off the court, doesn't come back, ruled out relatively quickly. Obviously, there's been reporting about he's going to get an MRI. We're recording this Thursday afternoon, right? So we don't necessarily know right now what the outcome of his MRI is, right? But the fact that he, I guess, hasn't been completely ruled out yet for the rest of the series, I guess that's a good sign. But obviously, this impacted this game in a bunch of ways because, I mean, for Houston, the nice thing for them, I guess, is their offense was better in this game. Still shot only 45% from the field, which isn't terrible. But the key here, 38% from 3, 15 for 40. Jalen Green, 38 points, 6 assists, 3 steals, 8 of 18 from 3. Several of those 3 by the end were kind of just practice shots where, like, you could tell Golden State was probably a little bit, perturbed by the fact that Butler got hurt, because obviously it kind of resets what their team looks like. But that was kind of the key in this game, was it did feel like even before the Butler injury, the Rockets had a lead, and it felt like it was a little bit more, they looked more comfortable than they did in the first game. And Green, even early on, you could tell based off of his drives and his attacks to the basket, and also his passing and playmaking, which had been a key part last year when he had that stretch where he was, scoring every night, but also allowing himself to make plays for others. It's pretty obvious when Jalen Green, is on his game. It makes Houston a lot better. I believe they're 13-1 when he scores 30 or more. It might be 14-1, I guess, after this game. So it's pretty clear and like we talked about, he's the X factor for this series, where if he plays well, it may tip the series to Houston or towards Houston, because then everything else kind of locks into place where, your offense is better. You have more perimeter scoring, right? You have a guy that can get hot. And also, if he can play make, can find ways to get others involved. Then also, if you're scoring, it limits the amount of transition the other team can get into. It limits the amount of turnovers. I mean, they had 10 turnovers in this game, which I guess is an improvement from the first game. But just as a whole, they did look more comfortable. Van Vliet still shot pretty poorly, 2 of 8 from the field. But you got a better game from like Atari Eason. Brooks shot the ball fine. Amen Thompson looked better. But obviously, the big thing was the Butler injury, right? Because there was some online discourse about, I guess, whether or not it was a dirty play. I mean, I'm going to be honest, like, post-game presser, Steve Kerr, he said that he didn't feel like it was intentional. He thought it was like, I guess just guys kind of bumping into each other, kind of an unfortunate play. And you could kind of tell based off of when it happened. I don't think anybody felt like that there was, like, intent with that play. I mean, obviously, over the course of the game, it got pretty physical and whatnot, but that was also just where the game was heading. You could tell early on the way the officiating was, like, they were preparing for a more physical matchup, but I don't think it was necessarily like a dirty play. It was just kind of like, because I think it was like, what, Pods bumps into Adams, who bumps into Draymond, who bumps into Thompson, and then eventually that kind of just pinball effects into Butler, him kind of falling underneath him. So I don't think there was ill intent, but this is one of the drawbacks, obviously, with Butler, and this isn't his fault, but he is a guy that does, because of his style of play, can be prone to injury. This isn't his fault. This is a freak injury. But still, that's always the concern, with those type of players is, they can be in weird situations. Things happen. It's like what we talked about with AD, where, sometimes, it's not him like just, oh, I'm sore. Sometimes it'll be coming down wrong, or just sometimes kind of like finding just like weird situations to be in, just because of the styles of play. And again, like I said, this is a freak injury, but it's crucial for Golden State, because if Jimmy has to miss significant time in this series, it may tip the series in Houston's favor, because while Butler was out, Golden State just looked a lot rougher around the edges. And they were never like completely out of it because they were able to kind of make runs to get it within like, I don't know, 12, 10 or so. But every time they kind of got back into it, then the Rockets would make some shots and push it back up. But obviously for Houston, the offense is the X factor for them, and Green's the biggest part of that. And then for Golden State, you just need Jimmy Butler, right? Like even Steph wasn't as superhuman in this game, right? He had 20 points, but 6 for 15, 6 turnovers, did have 9 assists. Pods was also sick, apparently going into this game, did nothing, but of course, he was sick, so not really much you can do there. And they had to bring Kaminga in. Quite an adventure, right? Kind of made the case for why you probably shouldn't play. Had a couple of transition buckets, but just, he did look like a guy that kind of had not played in a while, but, it kind of is what it is at this point. And just, you don't want to be in a situation where if you're Golden State, you're forced to bring in like Pat Spencer or, and again, he had 11 points, but it's just you don't want to be in that situation like that where you're starting to rely on guys towards the end of the rotation because we know before the Butler trade, they were not very good. And now if Butler's hurt, you don't have some of the guys that were on the roster before he got traded. And it just becomes okay, a lot of Quentin Post, a lot of Kevon Looney, a lot of Buddy Hield, guys that like they kind of need to be okay, but it's very clear they don't want to necessarily have to rely on a ton. But that's kind of the spot you're in. Post, at least because he's a stretch five, like they want him to shoot threes. Looked pretty rough his first few attempts, and then made some the rest of the way. But like if you're Houston, you kind of live with that because then it turns into we don't care about anybody else other than Steph, right? Like
Literally.
we're not worried about anybody else remotely going off. And then, for Houston, that allows your defense to still be good. And their defense was good in game one anyways. It was just tough shot making by Golden State. But for Houston, it comes down to the offense. And then for Golden State, they need Jimmy. If he can come back, by the time this, in a couple of games or so, like they can still win the series. And they're probably the favorite. Now, obviously, could they win a game without him at home? Sure, it could happen if Houston just has a terrible offensive showing. But just the way that you can slow down this Warriors team is a lot different if Butler doesn't play. And I think that kind of lends itself, obviously he's their second best player. So if you're not going to have your second best player, it makes it easier for the other team to win. But at the very least for Houston, like at least there were signs that Green looked at least a little bit more comfortable in this game after a pretty atrocious game one. But they're going to need more of that from him. Like, I don't think they can win the series because we talked about it. If he's bad, they have no chance of winning the series. If he's good, they have a shot. Maybe it's not like a guarantee, but if you can get anywhere close to 25 plus, for a couple of games, then you can kind of hope for, all right, this was the Jalen Green game. Could we maybe have one more game where it's like a bunch of the role players get hot? Could we have a game where maybe some of the vets get hot? Something like that, because you need those type of games to, in a 7-game series. So again, if you're Golden State, you feel good at the fact that you're going back home with a split, but you don't feel good about the Butler situation because, again, even if he comes back and plays, what condition is he in? Because you kind of need him to be able to go all out for them to have a good shot. Because he can still do other things other than score, but just defensive plays, playmaking, all that is a lot easier when you're fresher. Good news is they have multiple days off, but still not great to be in this position if you're Golden State. And this was always, I guess, the potential concern of this group is, they're kind of thin, and if any one of those core guys either is hurt or compromised, which you can say about a lot of teams, but you have to at least factor it in a little bit more with these guys because their core guys are older, right? They're 35 plus, so there's always the potential either for injury or just fatigue, right? Like, and if the longer it goes on, it may just benefit Houston because they are bigger and more athletic, and that can wear a small team down in a 7-game series. So ideally, if you're Golden State, you need to win. But if you win both of these home games, series is pretty much done. But for Houston, you just kind of have to do what Golden State does and get a split. And without Butler, it's a lot more doable.
Yeah, 100%. I think, obviously the story of the game for sure is going to be Jimmy Butler going out, and I don't think it was intentional at all. I don't think there was any malicious intent with Thompson going after the loose ball rebound, whatever the case may be. Like you said, more of a domino effect, and just physicality kind of just spreading around the court. That's what it is. Sometimes, stuff like that happens in basketball. But, at the end of the day, I think the MVP of this game goes to Jalen Green. I think the aggression was there right out of the gate. And, if you watch the game, the first quarter, the Rockets brought the, intensity on both ends of the floor, just like in game one. And they kind of kept it up this time, though, throughout the entire game. Granted, it's kind of hard to, credit them fully when the Warriors were not fully healthy because they didn't have Jimmy Butler, and we already know how important he is to this team on both ends of the floor. And in the 8 minutes, that he played, I think the impact was positive. And as soon as he was out, you could really just tell they had nowhere to really go, outside of Steph. And like look at the Rockets and how they played defense this game. They had Alperen Sengun on Moses Moody. I think that should tell you enough, about what Houston's game plan is and what they intend to do throughout the entire series, especially if, Jimmy Butler's either not going to be playing or he's not going to be 100%. How deep can this Golden State Warriors bench be? Probably not that deep. You bring a Jonathan Kuminga out who's pretty much been ice cold. You didn't play him in the play and you didn't play him in game one either. So he hadn't played in a decent stretch of time, and you expected him to kind of just go off. Like I don't understand the logic behind that, and that's why I think we were kind of advocates of him, potentially playing in the play, and just to get that rust off a little bit. Because say you do need to, have a guy like him out there who can kind of provide you a little bit of offense if there's a cold spell going on. So I didn't really like that from Golden State's perspective. But overall, I think the Houston Rockets, they played a very good brand of basketball, kind of strayed away a little bit, I think, from what they normally do in the regular season.
3-point shot happy.
Exactly. Yeah. I was kind of, I don't know. It felt like they were playing, a little bit looser. And I guess that's what you kind of should expect, in a game two when, you've kind of got the jitters out, a little bit. You gotten a little bit of a taste of what playoff basketball is like. Do I like Jalen Green, shooting 18 threes? No, I don't. But he made 8 of them, so I can't complain about it at all. Fred VanVleet, his inefficiency still scares me. Defensively, at least he's, engaged. Offensively, engaged in setting guys up and feeding a hot hand, of course. But the efficiency was kind of jarring in my opinion. I think Dylan Brooks showed up. Amen Thompson showed up for sure. Tari Eason showed up on both ends of the floor. So, a very complete game from the Houston Rockets. But, something in the back of my mind is really telling me I don't know if it's too legit because of Jimmy's impact on both ends of the floor was sorely missed, tonight. And it was just, it was rough. I really feel bad for Warriors fans, but at the same time, I can't condone the fact that they're trying to paint the narrative that it's a dirty play. I just can't get behind that. But the officiating of the game, and that was something that we had talked about going into the series, that yep. I will say there is a sense that, they are letting them play. Maybe a little bit too much because in all reality, you can't argue that they aren't holding and grabbing Steph, 90% of the time on and off the ball. And I think that does hinder, what he's able to do. But that's low-key the only way that you can really make him uncomfortable without truly, fouling him. But the playoff whistle is a thing. And yeah, I think this series is probably going to be like the most physical of all the first-round matchups. And, you're going to see it on both ends of the floor because don't get me wrong, the Warriors are not, getting off scot-free from that narrative as well because they have some physical guys as well. There were some plays, from Draymond Green even where, he's kind of holding guys and obviously baiting them into, off-the-ball fouls and stuff like that. But, he's engaging it and he's starting these, 1st and 10 football matchups, which are crazy. It's like guys are getting jammed up at the line. But, I wish the series isn't ruined, and I hope that it's not ruined because Jimmy Butler's hurt. You never want to really see that, and you never really want to take pride, I think, in a win like that. Granted, we've seen it happen before, but at the end of the day, I really wish we could have seen fully healthy Rockets versus fully healthy Warriors in game 2.
Yeah, because, like from the Rockets' perspective, like you said, like everything changes on both ends of the floor with Jimmy because he can also help defensively. Maybe they force more turnovers if Butler's out there, right? Maybe, maybe there's a way to kind of shut off the water from some of these guys in terms of getting some rebounds. You just, again, that's part of the impact that he brings. Mm-hmm. But again, from Houston's perspective, even before Butler got hurt, it did feel like that there was at least a better level of comfort
100%.
From some of these guys. And like you said, the way that the Warriors kind of were able to sneak back into the game at different points was because they got very 3-point shot happy. Some of that was, I think, Warriors started playing zone and started inviting them into taking threes because
Agreed.
that's not really Houston's game.
Hmm.
But Houston was able to make them pay because they were making those threes. And that's kind of it's a huge variable for Houston because they're not a very good 3-point shooting
Yeah.
team. And that's in theory like a way to maybe slow their offense down. But then the issue is they can still get offensive rebounds. And I mean, they had what, 36 or no, they had 11 offensive rebounds in the game, which I think was what, a little bit less than game one,
Yeah.
right? But like they also made way more shots. So like you're just going to see fewer offensive rebounds if more shots go in. And that's kind of the problem. Is just like the rebounding advantage that Houston is going to have is very significant. And that allows them, even if their offense is kind of stinky, it allows them to at least get some extra possessions. And they're able
Shooting
to do that.
time
Like
off the
say
clock too.
yeah, or say like an Alperen Şengün. He was 6 for 15, but nobody would have said he had a bad game because he still had 17 points and 16
Yeah.
rebounds and even had 7 assists, right, and a couple steals.
Hmm.
So like you said, there's an element of for Houston, they're the bigger team, so they have to be physical. And, in theory, usually like, if the whistle is if they're not going to call as much stuff, you would think it would benefit like a smaller team that has to be physical in
Hmm.
order to win. But it can also in some ways help Houston because like you said, it allows them to kind of get away with some stuff as well. But this has kind of been a theme through all the playoff series. We've
Yeah.
seen other series as well, and we'll get into those, right?
Yeah.
Where there's a lot of physical play. It's just the only issue is you kind of wish that the whistle was a little bit more consistent, where it's like there's stretches where it's like, okay, they can't call everything. But then there's also like stretches where it's like you don't call certain stuff, but then there's other stretches where you are calling touch fouls,
Right.
and that's where it gets a little bit tough, I think, for maybe some of the players to adjust. But either way, like you said, hopefully Butler can come back, so that way, like you said, it's not a series ruined by injuries.
Right.
We just don't know at this point, so we'll have to see where it goes. But just a tough spot to be in, and that's why in the playoffs these are the type of things that can kind of hurt a team's momentum and hurt a team's run, right? Because for the Warriors, freak injury, but they did have to play a ton and they had to play every game like it was their last game, right, for the last couple of months because of the spot they were in going into the going into the Jimmy trade.
Yeah.
So that's the downside where it feels like they're still probably better than Houston, but again, if Houston has big offensive nights like that, they could win in theory, even if Butler plays, just because there is a level of, you know, we know the defense and the rebounding is going to be there, but they have to clean up some of those possessions that they have. Like where, like you said, if Houston gets in the long scoring droughts, that's a problem because, Golden State with Butler, they can get back and eliminate some of those droughts, even if Steph's not out there. But, when Steph wasn't out there, that's the difference because they got annihilated in some of those stretches
Hmm.
because again, you're relying on guys who are going to look significantly worse, without Butler. And that was the whole issue that they had before the Butler trade because, some people were like, they need to get rid of some of these role players. And like, yeah, they're not great, but they'll at least look better and more optimized when Butler's out there.
Agreed. Yeah.
And then, even a guy like Podge, in theory, he was sick, so he could have helped, but he couldn't do anything in this game. I
Yep.
mean, he only played like 15 minutes, if that. So, we'll see where this series goes, but I think if you're either team, you don't feel terrible about a split. Like if you're Houston, I think you probably had to expect you were going to lose one of the first two games in
Hmm.
Houston.
Hmm.
And then if you're Golden State, like, your mission is we need to go into Houston and take at least one game. We may not be able to take both. Could they have taken this one if Butler played? Like, yeah, sure, obviously. We just, it's kind of hard to guess on that
Yeah.
one.
It's more of a
Because if
what if.
Houston yeah, it's more of a what if. Because if Houston's shooting had kept up, like they could have won the game. Because that's
Yeah.
the big thing we talked about with the Rockets, where if Green has a big game like that, you may not win because then it just makes things a lot easier for Houston and reduces the amount of bad possessions that they have. And like you said, there were some shots that some of these guys took that were not great, but there's still an element of like, hey, they were more successful at those shots in this game
Hmm.
versus the first one. And if they get more comfortable, that will help because that was a theme with a couple of the other playoff games that we saw where they felt like, with the young teams, where it felt like there was a little bit more comfort in the second game than the first one.
Agreed.
Yeah. We also had Nuggets Clippers game 2 since the last time we recorded, right? Because I believe that game was on what, Monday, right?
Yeah.
Nuggets Clippers, game 2. Great game, by the way. I mean,
Yeah.
just great series as well. Obviously, this one led by Kawhi Leonard. The Clippers were able to do what they weren't able to do in game 1, where this time they were able to close out Denver. Obviously led by Kawhi, 39 points, 3 rebounds, 5 assists, 2 steals, a block, 15 of 19 shooting from the field, 4 of 7 from 3. So crazy efficiency on, again, mostly jump shots and not very easy jump shots, like
Mhm.
shots where he's shooting over defenders, just getting to his spots. And that's kind of the thing that we hadn't seen with Kawhi, aside from the last couple of months since he's come back from his injury. It's funny because last year a lot of people up until he got hurt were pretty high on the Clippers, and he was second team All NBA last season. So he had a great year last year that just ended up kind of being cut short by the injuries that he ended up having at the end of the season. But now he's back. Now he looks super explosive, super quick off the dribble, able to get to his spots, also able to defend because he was kind of a part of the Clippers' defensive strategy in terms of forcing Denver into turnovers and kind of baiting guys into spots like we talked about with some of these other teams. And you still got contributions from other guys. Zubac, 16 and 12. Harden, not as crazy of a game as the first one, but still provided 18, 7 assists. Norman Powell looks, I don't know, kind of a little bit of a fraudulent at different points, but he did make some big shots late, to his credit. But he's not been as impressive the first couple of games. Simmons didn't look as much of a train wreck as he did in the first game. He had a drive, but that was it. Then Derek Jones Jr. and Batum. And just kind of another back and forth game. And this one, when you look at the Nuggets, you kind of feel like the Clippers in the first game, where it feels like you should have won this game. Because if you're the Nuggets, like, you withstood like an all-timer from Kawhi. You withstood for most of the game. Kawhi just hitting everything under the sun. Didn't do much to adjust. Allowed him to play one-on-one against Jamal Murray and others. Didn't really double a ton. So you don't feel great about that. But still, you were able to withstand that. You withstood, 20 turnovers, right? Because, I mean, and including a number of turnovers that were just not very good. Michael Porter Jr. had a major bounce back game, 15 and 5. He had a really bad turnover late that I think, also was around the same time he hurt his shoulder. Um, and then even Russ, right? Gave him some decent minutes, 5 of 11, 3 of 6 from 3, 4 rebounds, 2 offensive. But just a tough spot to be in, honestly, because and then also Jamal Murray played pretty well, right? He was, I think, under the weather, but he shot over 50%, made most of his threes as well, right? And still dished out 6 assists and had got cooked by Kawhi, but had some other decent defensive plays at times. But it just is tough because you had the game. And you look at Jokic, and it was kind of a pedestrian game from him. Like, the stat line doesn't look bad. He still had 26, 11, and 10, and 3 steals, 50% from the field and from 3. But 7 turnovers, a lot of really just bad turnovers, right? Like, there was one where I think he thought the clock was gonna reset or something, and he just threw the ball away.
Mhm.
He had the one towards the end of the game that led to, I think, Kawhi scoring, where they were kind of swarming him in a way where, like, it looks like that can sometimes be an effective strategy. Threw the ball away. Also, 6 of 10 from the free throw line. Missed some late free throws that kind of were a problem. Christian Brown wasn't very good, so that was kind of an issue. They tried to kind of figure out, do we close with Russ and Porter? Do we close with one or the other? Do we close with Christian Brown? And yeah, it just wasn't a great showing either, I think, from Adelman. But then for the Clippers, again, you feel much better because it would have been really rough if you're the Clippers, where you blew game 1, and then if you had blown game 2 and you go back to LA, or you go to LA down 0-2, and you felt like you could have won both games, that would have sucked. So for Denver, you still don't feel great because there's also probably a fatigue factor, I think, as well. And the Clippers are really good defensively. They're able to kind of get into these spots where they can kind of force, say like a Jokic to overthink and, force him into some rough turnovers. Even a guy like Chris Dunn kind of comes from behind, comes from underneath, kind of swipes the ball and takes it away, makes some big plays there. So Zubac using his size, right? Not getting blocks necessarily, but just making him work on the offensive end. And that's what you have to do against this Nuggets team. But obviously for the Clippers, the big story is Kawhi's, brilliant game. And, again, it's good to see him back out there and playing at a super high level because we know he's another guy who's generally been a really impressive player in the postseason. And, these are the kind of games that kind of show why there are a lot of people that have become much higher on the Clippers than initially, right? Because I think the concern was going to be is you're like, because of what's happened in the past, you're almost kind of conditioned into just waiting
Hmm.
for something to happen. Like not in a funny way, like even
Yeah.
though it looks like we're kind of laughing, but like just, because you've been used to this before where like Kawhi will have some great games. It's happened 2 seasons ago, right? Where they played the Suns and he had 2 great games. Then he's hurt, doesn't play again. You don't see him again. And it just kind of felt like, yeah, it's probably time to write off the Clippers. And right as you write them off, then they're back. And if Kawhi's healthy, like they can win this series. And, we'll see if they get to the next round what happens. Obviously, this is still 1-1. But I think both teams do feel very even. It feels like the Clippers may be a little better because I think they have at least like one extra player that, even if they're not great, it's still somebody that can at least give them something. But, at the same time, the Nuggets could still bounce back, and win this series, but they do have to go into the Intuit Dome and take one, which, is possible. They've been fine on the road this season. But just as a whole, I don't know. Like, we picked the Nuggets in 7. Obviously, when you pick a team to win in 7, it's a coin flip. And right now, this series feels like a coin flip. May lean, may feel like it's starting to lean towards the Clippers. But again, I don't think the Nuggets are out of this series just yet. But you do get kind of concerned that these guys are, all these guys are having to play heavy minutes, and there may be a level of fatigue that might kick in. And if Jokic kind of runs out of gas, then Denver's definitely done because that's, the guy that you kind of have to, that's the foundation of your team. And then you kind of have to hope and pray you get contributions from guys that I don't know, because Christian Brown was fine in game 1, but he stunk in game 2, and then even on defense hasn't really helped. I mean, like the Clippers, by and large, their perimeter guys have had their way with them. I mean, like I know Harden and Powell weren't as efficient in this game, but some of that was just missed shots. It wasn't really like they were getting a ton of stops. And like Denver's defense has definitely not been atrocious at all since the first half of game 1. It's been better. But it does feel like that this series is kind of teetering. And I think you're just kind of waiting for one more impact player on either team to join the party. And if that happens, then, like I said, that's where it leans one or the other. But if you're the Clippers, again, you blew game 1, but at least you won game 2. So you still, I think, have to feel better if you're the Clippers because the series is tied and you're going back home. Whereas if you're the Nuggets, you did win game 1 by the hair of your chin, and then in game 2, you blew it. But, if you can clean up the turnovers, I think there's still a way for the Nuggets to get back, get back some of their mojo and still win this series. But I don't feel amazing about it.
Mm. Yeah, I agree, and it kind of goes back to the game 1 discussion we had. But from the Clippers perspective, how do you win a playoff game with 20 turnovers? You don't. And now look at the Nuggets. They had 20 turnovers and they did not win this game. And I think that's what it comes down to. It comes down, to poor execution, personnel issues as well. But, some of that is out of your control because Michael Porter Jr. going down with injury does not, that you can't control that really. And, bring in Russ, that helps. And he did, to his credit, actually do a lot, in the clutch, hitting threes and stuff like that and rebounding. But, at the end of the day, I think when your best player isn't mentally there, like you said, this was not a masterclass game from Jokic by any means. Like you can look at it and say, oh yeah, he had a triple double, it wasn't his fault. Yeah, well he had 7 turnovers and also just mentally was not there. You could literally tell. The turnovers are very uncharacteristic of him. Missing the free throws, that hurts as well. And it's like, you hate to lose this game if you're the Nuggets because you practically blew it away. You were efficient throughout the entire game. I think you were kind of doing very well offensively. The problem was you had Kawhi just going off with a vintage performance, and he was hitting everything. And I think that's the scary part about the Clippers. So if you did pick the Clippers to win this series, yeah, this game proves your point in case right there because, Zubac is giving Jokic trouble down low. Kawhi Leonard can take over a game instantly if he wants to. James Harden being the productive playmaker that he can be. I think the stinky part about the Clippers is Norman Powell, like you said. And I think people are waiting for him to show up because if he shows up and plays like he did in the regular season, then I don't think Denver wins this series. There's no way because offensively, I don't think they have the firepower or consistency, to keep that up. It's going to have to be, a Jokic and Jamal Murray backpack game with maybe Aaron Gordon and Michael Porter Jr. showing up, in various ways. And that didn't happen. Like, I would say Michael Porter Jr. showed up until his injury because he was rebounding the heck out of the ball. But then you look at Aaron Gordon, kind of just felt like he was out there, Obviously, defensively, we know that he's going to be pretty consistent, but offensively, I think is where you're like, wasn't really feeling it. And I think that goes back to Jokic also not being on his A game as well. And yeah, it really sucks because, like I said, they were efficient the whole game, and it's not that it's rare that they're efficient. It's just more so you want to walk away with a win when you're shooting the ball, lights out like that from three specifically.
Right.
But yeah, the bench battles in this game or in this series have been god awful. Like, and that's the funny part. A lot of people picked the Clippers because they thought, they're a little bit more deep. They had more reliability off the bench. You have Norman Powell as well in terms of the depth piece, but it's been bad. Like, outside of Russ and I guess Norman Powell, you really haven't gotten anything from the other guys. Like Peyton Watson, nothing.
Powell's the starter.
Exactly. And DeAndre Jordan, forgot he was even on the team, to be honest. Jalen Pickett playing weird minutes, scoring, having like 2 points or whatever in like both games.
Yeah, they had that weird lineup where they had like, Jordan and Pickett in, and it was bad.
Yeah, but like it's things like that where, you would think that the Clippers bench would kind of be outplaying them, but then you look over and, you're getting some stuff defensively from Derrick Jones Jr., corner threes from Batum as well. Nothing really from Simmons and nothing from Bogdanovich on both ends of the floor.
He had one drive that shocked me.
Yeah, exactly. And it was like, whoa, is he back? And then he disappeared. Absolutely disappeared. But, that's kind of just how this series is going to go. It's going to come down to, the starters playing. And I think you need to have, those consistent offensive games from the Nuggets guys, but I don't know if they could keep up defensively if Kawhi is going to continue to pop off like this, or even like, and even going back to game one, it was Harden who was popping off, and they really didn't have a good response, in my opinion. Like they really just squeezed by in game one. So I think that's where, if you did pick the Nuggets like we did, we're not feeling amazing about it. But there still is a pathway for this series, to keep going band for band, where it's like, they might keep exchanging wins, here and there. But it's really the first team to blink, I think, in this series. And Denver blinked for a long time in this game. Like that was a very bad meltdown because they really had it, honestly.
Yeah. It was like game one felt a little bit more characteristic of what you see from the Nuggets late in games.
Sure.
Game two was a lot more uncharacteristic, and that's the part that I think, like you said, you feel very disappointed about because I think you just would have liked to have seen, a little bit more from, what we saw from the Nuggets in terms of, like you said, taking care of the ball, and that was a major problem. And like you said, if Kawhi's going to outplay Jokic, then the Clippers are going to win this series, especially like you said, if you get something from one of Harden or Powell, and then you get a pretty consistent level of production from Zubac, because it just comes down to having another guy. And that's what you need if you're Denver. You need another guy. And if you don't have that, then, yeah, like you said, I don't know if they can, if they don't have a great shot of winning. Because again, Powell hasn't gone off yet. He made some shots late, but he did mostly nothing for most of the game. But if he shows up and gets a little bit more comfortable, then like you said, this series might be over for Denver, where like maybe they could still get it to 7, but it'd be tough to see them win. Because, you also need Jokic. I think you need him to be a little bit better. Like obviously, again, he's the guy that we usually look at as being the best player in the league. And again, his stat line hasn't been bad. It just feels like he's leaving a little bit of something on the table. And some of it I'm sure is probably fatigue because there's a high workload. But I think if he was, like he got outplayed by Kawhi in this last game. But if he can kind of come out and he can be the best player, and then you get whatever, you're hoping to get from the Nuggets guys, then they could still steal game 3. And we're recording this a few hours before game 3. So we'll see what happens by the time we record again. That game will be done and we'll be able to discuss it.
Hmm.
But either way, what a series. And it's great to see Kawhi back, in the postseason and see, what he can do. And then obviously for the Nuggets, this is a tough puzzle that they're going to have to try to find a way to solve because the
Yeah.
Clippers on both ends of the floor have given them problems. Even though, again, like you've gotten decent performances from Jokic and Murray. We've seen both of those guys play better. And I think they're going to have to probably be better if they want to win this series, unless you get, a crazy game from somebody else. Because, like you said, you got a good Porter game in game 2, but he was awful in game 1. And
Right.
I mean, you don't know what to expect. I mean, it's kind of like, Jalen Green esque, where game 1 he was horrible, and then game 2 he was great. So, I mean, obviously Porter's, you know, floor and ceiling is different from Green because he's not a ball handler or anything, right? He's more of a forward that kind of plays off of other guys. But just as a whole, a guy like that is the swing piece for Denver, just like Powell's kind of a swing piece for the Clippers,
Yep.
where like you kind of need both guys to be good, but the better they are, the more dangerous one or the other is going to be.
Yep.
So right now, it feels like it's leaning towards Clippers, but we'll see.
Yes, sir.
Then next up, Pistons Knicks.
Mm.
Pistons pull off the upset, win in New York to tie up the series 100-94. Similar to game 1, they controlled most of this game, but unlike game 1, they didn't completely blow it and give it away to the Knicks, right? And Cade Cunningham, big reason why, 33 points, 12 rebounds, only 3 assists, but still 2 steals, 50% from the field, 10 of 12 from the line, and that's a big thing, for him because he's got a size, and physicality advantage at the guard spot. Obviously, they're not putting guards on him like, it's OG, and maybe some other guys, but as a whole, he went basically like he played Brunson about as well as he could, like in terms of like matching their offensive production. And Cade probably a little bit better. Like Brunson was good, but if they're gonna play even, then that's a decent sign if you're Detroit. But then obviously, when you look around, then for Detroit, you got 20 off the bench from Dennis Schroeder, right? 6 of 10 from the field, hit 3 threes, including a big one, right, to kind of put the game away for the Pistons. Tobias Harris still gave him double figures, 15 points, 13 rebounds. Jalen Duren with 12 and 13. And that's kind of the thing is like you just look at Detroit and it just felt like they got a little bit more. Shot horribly from 3, 6 for 27, but they got to the line 34 times. They got 12 offensive rebounds. And 15 turnovers, which isn't great. But, like they had a horrible stretch of turnovers in game 1, right? Where it was like just one after the other, and that contributed to the Knicks getting back in the game. And then you look over at the Knicks side, and not much other than just Brunson. Like Bridges had 19, so offensively he was better. Still 3 of 11 from 3 though. +1, in the plus minus, but just a little bit disappointing. But then also you look at Towns, 10 points. I think he was scoreless in the second half, which that shouldn't happen. And then Josh Hart, 10.7 rebounds, 5 assists. You don't have to have big scoring games from Josh Hart necessarily. And then OG Anunoby kind of coming back down to earth, right? He was 4 for 10, 0 for 4 from 3. And it just felt like for the Knicks offensively, it just doesn't look quite like what you saw in the regular season. And maybe some of that's just it's the playoffs and some guys aren't going to go off as much, but it just feels like it's kind of defaulting back to too much Brunson. And it's not like his fault. Like it's not like he's just going into ball hog mode, but it just feels like the Knicks aren't doing a whole lot to kind of give, to kind of spread the offense around, to get guys good looks. Cause like say with Towns, it'd be one thing if he had 10 points, but he was like 5 for 20. But he only took 11 shots. And I think that's kind of the part that's disappointing is can you find ways to get more shots for some of these other guys? Like, yeah, Brunson took 27, but still, like some of that was out of necessity. So, and maybe some of that you could also credit Detroit defensively because, they've held the Knicks, they held the Knicks under 100 points in this game. But just as a whole, it's just kind of disappointing from the Knicks perspective. And, the series is tied, but if the Knicks didn't, if the Pistons didn't melt down in game 1, you could have made the case that the Knicks could have gone back to Detroit down 0-2. Luckily they're not. It's tied, so it's not the worst case scenario, but I think most people expected the Knicks to win both games in New York. And game two was just kind of disappointing from a Knicks perspective. And then obviously, if you're the Pistons, it's great because first playoff win since 2008. You have a real guy in Cade Cunningham who looked way more comfortable than he did in game one. The stat line may not look that different, but just watching him play and watching him operate, you could tell he was way better. And again, continuing to get contributions out of some of your veteran guys. Like Hardaway was 0 for 8, 0 points, but you got 20 from Dennis Schroeder. You even got Paul Reed to come in for like 10 minutes and gave him something because I think Isaiah Stewart was hurt. Didn't get much from Beasley shooting wise because, again, the 3-point shooting was terrible. But you got just enough from some of the other guys outside of Cade, and you held the Knicks offensively to below 100 points, which is not the type of game they want to be in. They want to be in a more high scoring affair. So if you're the Pistons, you're feeling good. I would still probably pick the Knicks to win the series just because I feel like they have more talent. But if you're the Knicks, it's not a great feeling to see, what could have been a disastrous first couple of games. But at least, the series is tied. You just have to take worst case scenario one in Detroit. Maybe they can take both because we'll see what the Pistons will do going back home. But, it's funny because I don't know, maybe you feel a little bit lower on the Knicks based off of what you've seen in the first couple of games. But, you still also have to feel good about Detroit because, again, like they're playing with house money. Nobody expects them to win the series. And they go into the Garden and they take a game that, the Knicks tried to get back in, but the Pistons for most of the series have been in control. It's just, again, the difference was the horrible fourth quarter in game one. And that's not, I think, what you'd like to see if you're the Knicks. So I think there are ways to kind of get it back under control and improve. But I don't know. It's like, I think it'll get better, but it doesn't feel amazing. But it could be worse.
Yeah, I 100%, credit what the Pistons, did this game. They came back into game two and they adjusted, fully, completely. And it starts at the top with Cade. The Knicks came in with the same strategy from game one, throw everything in the kitchen sink at Cade, and he responded, I think, in the best way possible with more aggression. Didn't defer from the doubles, didn't run from them. He actually took them head on, and that's why he was at the line a lot, drawing a lot of contact, being that guy that he was all throughout the regular season. And, the proof is in the box score, Look at the other guys like Malik Beasley. Those are guys that kind of, had a solid showing in the first game, Tobias Harris. And, Cade had a lackluster one. But here, it's more so the opposite. And I think that's going to be the recipe for success, from Detroit. Because at the end of the day, like, then that's not what the Knicks want. They cannot have a game where Cade Cunningham matches or exceeds, Jalen Brunson in productivity. And offensively, they look god awful. Karl Anthony Towns didn't really do anything. And I think that's the big key piece for me. Obviously, I guess I do like Mikal Bridges taking 18 shots, but I don't like the fact that he didn't really make a lot of them. I would prefer that the ball is shared a little bit more amongst those wing guys like OG Anunoby. I think he deserves more than 10 shots. And it's like the inefficiency from those guys really just threw me off. And I think it threw their entire vibe off, because you can't really go to that bench, for elite offense or anything like that. And it starts with Brunson, but it just, I don't know. Like I said, you do have to credit Detroit in their defense because they did a phenomenal job, making those guys borderline, useless in this game, really, on the offensive end. And, defensively, I was very disappointed in the wings, OG Anunoby. I think he did okay against Cade for some stretches, but not nearly the same, I think, motor as there was in game one. And I think that's going to be the problem because, defensively, how does this team look in the playoffs? Pretty bad so far, and I think, like you said, you would much rather prefer their games to be shootouts, but you have to win those shootouts. You can't have games where your guys just aren't efficient or Towns doesn't dominate alongside Jalen Brunson, in that two-man game. And that's where I think, Detroit's personnel, they did a great job of taking that away a little bit, making Towns think, second guess himself in terms of the shots. But I think him only having 11 shots and being the number two option hurt the team, in drastic ways because, Detroit is a I think, a much better defensive team than New York, so they can kind of get away with, okay, Cade is pretty much our offense, and we have, some role players show up offensively as well, but defensively, they really just took everybody else out of the game. And I don't know how sustainable, this version of the Knicks are going to be in the playoffs. Like, even if they do get out of round one, and that's a big if now, I think, since the series is tied 1-1, I don't think a lot of people expected that and expected Detroit to really take a game in New York, but especially this early. But, after round one, what does this team really bring? Because they can't compete defensively with pretty much anybody in the East.
And that's going to be the problem, because ideally the best version of the Knicks is the offense is kind of spread around and it's not just Brunson, kind of carrying you to wins. And obviously, like, that's part of his game. But we've seen this year, like, he's obviously more than comfortable spreading the ball around and playmaking, and getting other guys involved, because we've seen that, with him in the two-man game that he has with Towns, and some of the other games where, again, there were stretches where Brunson was out, right? And then you got big games from Anunoby, and others. And again, part of that is like, yeah, with Brunson back, he's going to have the ball in his hands more, but it still feels like there's a level of like creativity that's just lacking offensively, and that's supposed to be the Knicks' strong suit. Because, like we said, if it's a grinded out game and it's low scoring, like you said, that benefits Detroit. Because, like you said, you could get away with, an ugly game from mostly everyone else offensively, but then also like Dennis Schroeder off the bench. Like, he's probably better than any of the Knicks guys
Agreed.
off the bench. And so, I mean, he outscored the Knicks bench himself, right? Because, I mean, the bench for the Knicks was just Deuce McBride. That was it. He had 8 points.
Yep.
Nobody else off the bench scored.
Yep.
So, that's kind of the difference there and that was always going to be an issue with the Knicks anyways, is the lack of depth. The strength is the starters. So if the starters play poorly, outside of like Brunson, then you're hoping and praying that somebody comes off the bench, and there's just nobody offensively that you can really rely on. Like, you got that with Campaign in game 1, did pretty much nothing in game 2, didn't even play a whole lot. I think he only played like 4 minutes.
Yep.
So, that's partly because the starters played like 40 plus minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always going to be the issue for the Knicks as well. But like you said, with the Pistons winning game 2 in New York, like, you have a series now. And like you said, even if the Knicks get out alive, which you still expect them to, but it's not a guarantee, you just don't know how far they can go, because they just have to be better than that. And I think that's kind of the disappointing thing. And this could be another one of those teams. Obviously, you don't want to say too much about it, but this could be another one of those teams where if they go out early, there's probably going to be some changes.
Oh, yeah, big time. And, even coaching, I think, throughout this series, I think, JB Bickerstaff, he did a good job, in game 2. Horrible job in game 1, so great bounce back. And I think, Thibodeau, solid job in game 1, very, very bad job in game 2. Because I think there's got to be a way to get the ball to Towns, more so than, some other guys. And it's not that, like you said, it's not that Jalen Brunson, it's not bad when Jalen Brunson takes 27 shots. It's just better if Towns is taking, maybe 18 instead of 11. Like, that's where I think I just don't understand why Towns didn't really do much this game.
Yeah, that's the disappointment, because that's kind of a swing piece. If he had had a better game, I mean, they were down by a decent amount for a decent chunk of the game.
Yeah.
But, like, at least might have been a little bit more back and forth, because the final score looks a little bit different, because the Pistons looked like they were getting ready to throw another game away, but they did close it out, because the Knicks got some good looks, because, like, Bridges had a wide open 3, didn't make it. I think Brunson had a decent
actually.
look. Yeah, didn't make it, and so that's kind of the difference there. But, that's going to happen in some of these games where the shot's just not going to fall.
Yep.
And those are the type of games that the Knicks will probably lose if the shots aren't falling. Then we had another big game, Lakers-Wolves, game 2. Lakers bounced back pretty much in the ways that I think we expected them to.
Yes.
We predicted that they would win game 2. It did get close towards the end of the game, but they were up by double digits for the vast majority of the game, right? Like, obviously the Wolves got back in it, and you kind of expected the Lakers to kind of let go of the rope a little bit once it felt like we probably have this game. But, you look around, Luka offensively led the way with 31, 12, and 9. Most of that, I think, through the first 3 quarters, not as much in the fourth. But then obviously LeBron was also a big difference maker, major bounce back game. Didn't score, crazily in terms of efficiency, but still had 21 points, 7 assists, 11 rebounds, and defensively was pretty much everywhere. And that was the key for them in this game. He set the tone on the defensive end, and you could kind of see just the level collectively in terms of physicality and effort was a major difference in this game. I mean, even Gabe Vincent had a block, right? I think on Nas Reed or somebody like
Hmm.
that, a bigger player in the game. Dorian Finney-Smith didn't, had one block, but did a really good job in kind of not just letting guys go to the rim. Even like Luka and Austin, right? Those are guys who are not known as great defenders. Those guys gave a decent amount of effort on the
Hmm.
defensive end and made significant plays there. Rui as well, right? Monster defensively, flying around, moving pretty well, staying in front of guys, getting some rebounds. And that was kind of the big key there was you needed to see those guys bounce back. We needed to see them have a better performance, better attention to detail. Because in the first game, like, yeah, we didn't expect in game two the Wolves to shoot 50% again from three. But again, we talked about it where most of those looks were pretty open. Like they just gave up a bunch of uncontested threes to Minnesota, overhelped in the paint, led to a lot of good looks from three. And if you get a lot of good looks from three, you're a lot more likely to shoot 50%, right? It wasn't like they were, shooting 50% on all contested shots like Kawhi, right? A lot of those shots were wide open,
Hmm.
including from guys who are good 3-point shooters.
Hmm.
Now, the Wolves shot horrifically from three in this game, 5 for 25, right? The Lakers also shot horrifically from three, 6 for 29. And I think part of that is the legs defensively. Like LeBron contributed a lot on defense, shot 1 of 5 from three. But, but some of his misses were like, those were open shots. And it's just like, you just couldn't make them because you didn't have any legs. Austin was 0 for 6 from three. Had a couple of tough moments, but a lot of his threes were like relatively decent shots, right?
Hmm.
Compared to the first game where he was just launching like whatever, whenever. Had a couple of horrible decisions with in terms of lobs, right in the fourth quarter, and like that also kind of contributed to the Wolves coming back because the Lakers just had a weird stretch offensively where they were just kind of like, not really doing anything serious, and that's been kind of a problem for them. But we needed to see them bounce back on both ends of the floor. And offensively, still wasn't great, still got stagnant at points, but they made it a rock fight in a way where that can help the Lakers. And this is another game where we talked about like the physicality from both teams was very much there. Because in the first game, the Wolves won the physicality battle by a ton, and then the Lakers matched that, and it led to stretches where like the Wolves guys started picking up fouls, right? And this was another one of those games where there were stretches where they didn't call things, and then there were other stretches where they called everything. So you got kind of a mix of both. A lot of guys that were in foul trouble, especially for Minnesota, right? I believe they had what McDaniels and Randall had 5, Conley and DiVincenzo I think had 4, and then from the Lakers right side, I think Jackson Hayes had 5 and looked pretty atrocious in this game. LeBron had, I think, 4 fouls because he was guarding Randall for a decent stretch of the game. And then I think a couple of the other guys had 3. So pretty physical game. We still haven't seen a Laker game where all 3 guys offensively play great, right? Like it's kind of like, a little bit in spurts, but it's not really been there. The ball movement hasn't been as there as much, but it was still a better performance from the first game. And then, you look over at Minnesota's side, Randall's continued to have a pretty good series, right? He's had 27 and 6 in this game, and that's kind of a swing piece where he's a guy that's generally been looked at as a poor playoff performer, but he's been really good in this series. You got a little bit more of a muted game from Ant. Like he wasn't bad or terrible, but it felt like he was a little bit underwhelming. And that's kind of a key thing in this series where if it's kind of a question of like, is Randall better than Ant in this series? That's probably not a great thing for Minnesota. Because I just think defensively, if you're the Lakers, you live with some of the Randall stuff. Like you live with him going one on one and taking guys off the dribble. You got to live with the jump shots because it is what it is, right? Like you're not going to, overplay and change the way you guard him if he's knocking down threes. You live with it, right? McDaniels didn't do as much. So the role players for Minnesota didn't do quite as much. And you got an okay game from Ant, but not great. And then a good game from Randall. So that's kind of the question where if you're the Wolves, you still probably feel a little better than LA just because you did your job, you got the split. Now you go back to Minnesota. But, in fairness to Minnesota or in fairness to LA, we've seen the Wolves bungle home games before. Because even last year, they did great in Denver. They won 3 games in Denver in the Denver series. But last year in the playoffs, they also lost a lot of games in Minnesota. Because I think they lost what? 3 in Minnesota, I think, in against the Nuggets. And then I think they lost what? 3 in Minnesota against Dallas.
Hmm.
Like they actually won more games, I think, on the road than at home last year in the playoffs. Little bit different team because there's no Towns, but just as a whole, it still feels like a series that's probably going to go longer. But I just think, I think both teams can kind of come out of this feeling like we can be better than what we saw. But I think if you're LA, this was a must-win game, and they treated it like a must-win game. Because if they lose that game at home, the series is probably done. Like maybe they don't get swept, but it's highly unlikely that they win. But now we have a series going back to Minnesota, and we'll see where this goes from here. But I think you can see. I think you can see a better version of any of the key guys for both teams, But my only concern is like with Randall, is he going to keep doing this every game? Because I think you're also kind of waiting for him to have a game where he doesn't play as well. But he's played in a way where he's taking advantage of, some of the matchups. He's being pretty physical. So he's playing in a way that maybe you feel like could be sustainable. But I just feel like as a whole, if you're LA, you're okay with him playing one-on-one. It's just what would worry you is if everybody from Minnesota goes off. If everybody from Minnesota goes off, you got a problem if you're LA. I think if you're LA, you could win if you get like, your 3 stars and then maybe like a couple other guys. But I think for Minnesota, if they win this series, it's going to be because it's, a team effort. And also, obviously, you need Edwards to be really good. And I think you're waiting for him to have a big night.
Yeah, this is exactly the way that the Lakers probably wanted to win this game. Looking at Minnesota and the production that they got, pretty much just only Ant and Julius Randle. And I think that's going to be the recipe for success because if Jaden McDaniels doesn't show up offensively, Gobert doesn't show up offensively, which we already know he won't. Nas Reed
Yeah.
doesn't show up offensively. I mean, what on earth can you really do? The only way that the Minnesota Timberwolves would have been able to win this game is if Anthony Edwards had 40. Realistically, maybe like 35ish or whatever. But I just don't think that that's
Yeah.
probably going to happen. And if it does, it's probably going to be on the latter end of the series. But I think the series is going to be over rather quickly because I'm just not too high on the surrounding personnel of Julius Randle and Anthony Edwards offensively. And, it's tough because you have to compete with a guy like Luka, who's pretty much going to average and put up 30 points, a night in the playoffs. And that's rough. And then you have to contend with Braun, who we already know is most likely to pop off as well. AR is in kind of like the back pocket as well. And defensively, the Lakers have the guys, to be those roamers and be disruptors and true, lockdown defenders like Dorian Finney-Smith, Rui Hachimura, all those guys being out there and using their size and their length to match that of, Minnesota. And I think that's the key, bothering guys and making sure that Jaden McDaniels is not a threat offensively. Because I think, with him, he had looks, but they weren't really good looks. They kind of forced him into tough contested shots, which really isn't his game. He's better, you know, if he's wide open in the corner, hitting corner threes or getting out in transition, things like that. And they didn't really let him do that. And that's great. That's going to be the key is to take out the other guys. Because I think at this point, Julius Randle's probably going to give you guaranteed buckets from what we've
Hmm.
seen through the 2 games. Anthony Edwards will give you some buckets, but it all comes down to his playmaking and, 0 assists in this game. Granted, look at the teammates, look at the box score. You didn't get anything from really anybody. So can't really fault him there, but that's the way to take him out of the game because, his 25 points, solid, but they feel very empty because it didn't really result in anything. It didn't really result in generating great looks, I think, offensively for the Timberwolves. And I think if you pick the Lakers, to win this series, this is exactly why. Because, you look at the personnel offensively, Braun super engaged defensively. That was special. But offensively, you've got Luka and you've got AR and Braun. I think at some point those guys are going to wake up and it's going to be over for Minnesota pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, and that you mentioned Gobert, and he's not really done a whole lot, mainly on the offensive end. Like
Mm-hmm.
I know he got picked on at times defensively, but he did a decent job, especially in the second half of like, kind of making sure that like, all right, it felt like they were just kind of just relentlessly going after him, and he did an okay job at shutting the water off. But I think the problem is that we've talked about it for Gobert. It's not so much defensively, but offensively, that's always been the issue with him is that he can't really punish you for being small because he's not a very skilled offensive
No,
player,
not at all.
right? And that's what we're seeing so far because the Lakers, outside of Hayes, don't really run any other centers, and he played what, less than 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So I mean that means for 40 plus minutes of the game, they're not running a center out there at all. It's like, LeBron and Rui and Gobert. He's not doing a ton around the basket, not even getting a whole lot of rebounds, not even putting guys in foul trouble or anything like that. You're just getting a pretty empty game from him.
Hmm.
And I think, if you're Minnesota, in some ways you can make the case like, yeah, well, if we put Nas Reed out there, it makes you better offensively. But then in some ways you could make the case defensively that might help the Lakers in some ways because, Reed is mobile and he's not certainly not like a terrible defender at all, but just in terms of Gobert, what he's able to do around the rim defensively, like I think you would at least like to have some of that, and it's so much harder to keep him out there if he can't really take advantage of that. So that's kind of the issue there. I think if you're, Minnesota, but like you said, if you're the Lakers, you just got to shut the water off for the role players because then it turns into, like you said, Julius Randle and Ant trying to beat you 2-on-5. And I think if you're the Lakers, you live with that because they're only going to be, they can only score but so much as a duo. And if you limit their playmaking, like you said, then that, it makes it just a two-man game. And I don't know if they're going to be able to win this series if it's just those two. I don't think they can. Like I said, I think it has to be by committee. And Edwards himself, he said after the game, like he was confused by what the Lakers did defensively. And if you do that in the LA, you've done your job. Because in the first game, he wasn't super efficient, but like you said, he had like 9 assists, and everything was easy, right? Like just from that perspective, where he didn't have to do a ton of scoring. But in this game, like you said, the only way they would have won is if he had gone off, and they've done a decent job at not just letting him get to any and every spot,
Hmm.
and that's kind of what you want if you're LA. I guess the question is can the Lakers defensively, is what they're doing sustainable? I think
Think so.
ideally you would at least like to have get a little bit more out of, say like Hayes and Vando, but they've not really done anything in this series, right? Like I mean, they've been pretty brutal when they're I mean, Hayes was a +6, but just the minutes that he was out there just didn't feel like he was impactful, right? And he had a stretch in the fourth where he basically kind of gift wrapped Minnesota like 5 quick points, right? Because I think he set a moving screen, right?
Hmm.
Set a moving screen
Yeah.
offensively that led to a three, and then I think he goaltended on another possession, and he's just been bad. And that's kind of the tough part where like you can almost kind of feel like it would be nice if the Lakers had some type of extra big, on either end of the floor, right? Like defensively to help rebound, and then also offensively to provide an outlet for, the Lakers offensive guys, because without Hayes, you don't really have anybody you can throw lobs to create easy offense. It just feels like a lot of what they're trying to do on offense at times just feels like it's overly reliant on, trying to beat these switches. And it's kind of led to mixed results. But I think, like you said, I think that they can be better. Like, because there were a couple stretches where they were moving the ball around, and some of it's just like you're gonna have to live with it because that's what these guys do.
Hmm.
But I just think as a whole, I think we'll see a better version of them as the series goes on, and you're going to need to because I think you're probably not going to be able to get away with these offensive performances for the whole series. But at the very least, defensively, they did shut the water off. But I think the Wolves can be better too because I think there's like at least a happy medium where their role players aren't completely atrocious. But if you're the Lakers, I think you can find ways to slow down those guys. Well, we'll see, because like I said, it goes back to Minnesota with the series tied. And, again, we talked about it. It should be a really good series. I know you had it going shorter, but just as a whole, I think if the Lakers can at least, worst case scenario, figure out some of the offensive lulls, then I think that can probably put the series away.
100%. And like my thing with with this series is as long as Gobert is out there, you really don't need a big. I think you know what I mean. Where it's like he's not going to
They've
hurt
been
you.
able to guard. Yeah, they've
Exactly.
been able to limit.
He's not going to hurt you. But my concern is when Nas Reed gets in the game. I think that's where things can get a little dicey because
Yeah,
5 out and he can put the ball on the floor as a big man.
Yeah,
that's rough to kind of contend with. So I
right.
think he's
And
like
they're
the
still
major
big.
swing guy. Exactly.
Yeah, and they're still big, so he can still find ways to get rebounds and impact the game. So they've done a decent job so far in the second game because again, it was so stark game one
Hmm.
compared to game two that I don't know what to expect for game three.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's just a closer game all throughout, and that could be a potential swing game in the series. But if you're the Wolves, like I said, you did your job.
Yeah.
Then moving on, after that, we had a group of other games not quite as exciting as some of the other ones, but you kind of live with it. OKC Memphis, don't have to talk a ton about that. It was another blowout, right? OKC won convincingly. We know this is going to be a short series. It wasn't as much of a blowout as the first game, but you can still see the issue of OKC defensively shutting Memphis's water off. SGA was better in this game, still shot 10 for 30, but again, you don't need him to have like a crazy game against this team because of what they're able to do on the defensive end. And we know this is a good matchup for Jalen Williams, where he can kind of go off, and Memphis has no wings. But again, we knew this would be a quick series, so not a whole lot to really say about that one. Just more so, again, continuing to show why OKC is such an impressive team.
Yeah, this is the perfect series for Oklahoma City. It's the best reward, I think, for being the number one seed. You get to go up against, a number 8 seed in Memphis, and, you get to show why you really are, one of the favorites, if not the favorite to come out of the Western Conference. You look at the team,
Yeah.
they're super deep. They've got, every mismatch, available in this series. And yeah, I think it's a very obvious sweep, and just look at the point differential. It's kind of wild.
And it looks like Shams just put out, as we were talking, that Evan Mobley won Defensive Player of the Year.
All right. I'm not mad at it at all. I think that was both of our picks.
Yeah, tied for the youngest Defensive Player of the Year in NBA history with Dwight, Jaren Jackson Jr., Alvin Robertson, and Kawhi. So,
Very
that just came
deserved.
out as we were recording.
Deserved.
Yeah, that was both of our picks for
Hmm.
Defensive Player of the Year. And then Miami Heat Cavs, guess can talk a little bit about that. Cavs got hot in the fourth quarter, right? And again, this was a game where Miami was able to stick around for a decent amount of time, but then Donovan Mitchell went off in the fourth quarter, had like 17 points in the fourth, finished with 30. And this is why the Cavs are still so dangerous, because even with the game kind of back and forth, you got Mitchell, who we know is a guy in the playoffs who can rise to the occasion. Mobley was better in this game. And just as a whole, it's just too much talent to overcome, I think, for Miami. Ty Jerome didn't do as much, but DeAndre Hunter was better. And like I said, Mitchell popped off, and, Max Strus and Evan Mobley came out. And I just don't think there's a whole lot that the Heat can really do. Hero was good, was really good. Bam, pretty underwhelming offensively. But again, the Heat, I think, are just overmatched, and the Cavs are better. And this is another series that I think we expect to be done pretty quickly.
Yeah, I expect this to be a sweep, but with Cleveland, I think it's perfect. Kind of a similar situation, to Oklahoma City, and it's awesome for them to, be able to have those 3 guys that could potentially go off, at any given point in the game. You have Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland, who both played phenomenal, and then also you have Evan Mobley doing great things on both ends of the floor. So I think that's going to be, I mean, we already know that they're going to come out of the first round. I think it's more so, what do they look like come Eastern Conference Finals, potentially.
Yeah. Then also another one, Magic Celtics. Celtics, Tatum didn't play, out with a bone bruise. I don't think we talked about that because that hadn't,
Hmm.
we saw him get hurt, but we didn't know that he was going to be out.
Hmm.
But they didn't need him. Jaylen Brown at 36, 10 and 5, 5 of 7 from 3. Porzingis at 20 and 10 and a very bloodied head in the game.
Hmm.
And then Peyton Pritchard continued to play well, 14 points. Drew Holiday with 11. Just a team effort without Tatum. And then for the Magic, Paolo was great, continued to be really good. 32, 9 and 7. 12 of 25 from the field, 2 of 6 from 3. Franz at 25, but just still can't knock down his threes, and that's a problem. But everything else he's doing is fine.
Yeah.
But just the 3-point shot is it's very disappointing. Wendell Carter Jr., the 3-point shot coming back, but literally nothing from anyone else. Anthony Black was good, to be fair, but then KCP 1 for 9, 0 of 6 from 3. Just looks like that probably just was a signing that isn't going to work out.
Yep.
Maybe just age-wise, injury-wise, may have just kind of, leveled off.
Sure.
Don't know, but it kind of looks like that. But with the Magic, we knew that there was very little chance, little to no shot of them pulling off an upset in this series because they can't score. They're pretty reliant on 2 guys, and they just don't have outside shooting at all. Like you're just hoping and praying that their two best players kind of get hot from three, but neither of those guys are great 3-point shooters, and they don't have a lot of 3-point shooters around them. So it just kind of illustrates the need for the Magic to go out and get some type of offensive minded players in the offseason, whether or not it's a star or just some guys that can hit some shots. But they desperately need it because they do not have a lot of it. And then from the Celtics, this is why they're one of the favorite, or they're considered one of the favorites to win. Because even without their best player, they have a bunch of other guys that on any given night can contribute on both ends of the floor. And again, it's going to look pretty good against the Magic, but just as a whole, just just kind of sucks for Orlando the way that this season ended up going. It's not going to end, I think, as good as I think you might have hoped for.
Yeah, big time. With Orlando, I don't even think Jalen Suggs really gets you a win in this series at all. I just feel like, even with his creation, like
Right.
it still wouldn't be enough. You need more. You need more, especially if you're going to contend against, a team like Boston where they pretty much have creation all the way down to their freaking bench. And that's the crazy part. But like you said, at least Paolo seems to be very legit, awesome. Franz, 3-point shot, very fraudulent, but hopefully that develops a little bit later down the line. But time is ticking, I think. But yeah, for Boston, this is perfect. I know it was somewhat of a close game. Orlando really wasn't going away. They had some spectacular plays, down the stretch. But at the same time, you do have, a bona fide closer with Jaylen Brown, and you did get some very solid contributions from everybody else on both ends of the floor. So, to do this without Jason Tatum, I think still, they deserve a gold star. Because
Yeah.
you're without your best player, and your second best player stepped up to the plate. That's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Next man up, man.
Exactly. So again, now Boston's up 2-0. This is probably going to be another quick series, as we said. So not really a shocker,
Yeah.
honestly. Now the last one, Damian Lillard returned. 14 points, 7 assists, 4 of 13. Hit a couple of big shots, and the Bucks, to their credit, did make it a 2-point game with a couple of minutes left. But as a whole, the Pacers kind of continued to show why they're the favorites to win this series and why they're considered to be the better team. Just a very balanced offensive attack. Halliburton had a much better offensive game scoring wise, right? Because he had 10 assists in the first game, 12 assists in this game, and also had 21 points. Andrew Nemhard with 17 and 6, 6 of 10 from the field. Miles Turner with 15, Siakam with 24, Nesmith with 16, Mathurin with 14. Just overall balanced offensive contributions in a way that you're not getting quite as much of from the Bucks. Giannis had 34 and 18, did have 7 assists. Then you got 12 from Kuz, 28 from Portis off the bench, so that was good to see. And then Lillard, again, shot making wise was a little bit rusty in this game, but at least showed some playmaking. And I think you can at least make the case that if he can get closer to what he was before he got hurt, maybe they can make it a more competitive series. But it may just be too late. Now you're just kind of banking on you're going back to Milwaukee, and maybe the Bucks, can get a game or two in there and tie up the series potentially. But who knows? At the very least, it was close in the fourth quarter. So you could at least make the case of, hey, Lillard gets another game under his belt. Somebody else shows up offensively. Maybe the Bucks could can get back into this series. But just, it's tough because the Pacers, they made some big shots towards the end of the game. And if Andrew Nemhard kind of goes to what he was doing in the postseason last year, then there's probably just too much offensively that, for the Bucks to be able to keep up. And the Pacers can defend better than they did a year ago. So it still feels like the Pacers will still probably win this series. But I think at least you have a fighting chance now with Dame, especially if he can get back to form.
Yeah.
But we don't know if it's going to happen.
Yeah, I didn't get to watch a whole lot of this game. I believe it was on NBA TV. So, if you're in my boat, I feel you 100%. But, I'm going to try and talk about it to the best of my ability from what I did see, with highlights and stuff like that. Giannis continues to do his thing. We kind of predicted that he was going to pop off. Half right, because we also thought that it would translate to wins. Definitely didn't. But the main story, was that exactly, and it's not his fault at all. When we talked about the series initially, after game one, we were like, well, he might have to go 2018 Braun, but I don't even think that's feasible. Considering the fact about who's on this team. Brook Lopez, from what I saw in the highlights, granted, I didn't see the whole game, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. he might be cooked, like legitimately on the defensive end, because I believe every highlight that I saw, he was involved and he was pretty much getting scored on at some point, during the game. And I feel like that's probably somebody that you might have to move on from. And that was my one of my concerns, about this team was
He only played 16 minutes.
yeah, but like the freaking like the highlights, I don't know, on
But that's
YouTube.
what I'm saying. And like he only played 16
Yeah.
minutes because he had 4 blocks, but he wasn't really that good. And Bobby
Yeah.
Portis, kind of led the way offensively. He was a lot better than Lopez in that game.
Yeah, but like I feel like the core was the problem with this team going into the season. Granted, they did finish the season, I guess, a little stronger than I thought they would, but like Brook Lopez, age-wise, I don't know how much he has left in the tank. Obviously, they moved on from Middleton, but the Dame return, that I didn't love, and obviously we knew that he wasn't going to be, automatically ready to go and firing on all cylinders and dropping a 30 piece in his return, but at the end of the
Like 30.
day, yeah, exactly. So it's like, he played a lot, but it wasn't, a whole lot of great production. And I feel like I don't want to say it's sweet, but I feel like we do have to see them come home and see how they look at home before I think we do make a determination. But our pick might be cooked in terms
Well,
of
yeah, if they lose, then they'll be
yeah.
down 3-0-3, and it'll
That's my point. Like
but at least, yeah, but I think you can at least make the case that Lillard might be a little bit more comfortable, shake the rust off, and because he had he provided playmaking and extra
sure.
ball handlings, and which is pretty helpful for Milwaukee, even for Giannis too,
And it
because
was more
he does.
competitive.
Yeah, exactly. And in fairness, Indiana had big leads at different points, but the Bucks were able to cut into it because the 3-point shooting was a lot better in this game, 40% from 3.
Mm-hmm.
But the Pacers still shot 44% from 3 themselves,
Yep.
and just a lot of depth and a lot of talent. And it just feels like for the Bucks, it may just be too much to overcome.
I
And
agree.
we acknowledged going into the series that the Pacers were the better team. I just think we just hope maybe you might get a little bit more production from some of the guys outside of Giannis, but you just haven't gotten it. And
Yeah,
if you're not going to get it, then they pretty much have no chance of winning.
I agree.
Yeah, and we'll see now because now we're going into game threes, right? Because obviously before after we're done recording, we'll be through a trio of game threes, and obviously we'll be able to talk about those as they happen when we get in to our next episode. We did have a couple of NBA stories, I believe that came out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we did have a couple of stories that came out. We had one that was kind of entertaining where it was I guess a player poll, right, where they kind of basically asked about the players a bunch of questions about different things. Some of them were kind of insightful about things like do you like the setup of shortening the games by a couple minutes, like do you prefer 10-minute quarters, and they were like no. There was a question of like, would you want less games but at the cost of lower salary? And it was like no. There was a question of were analytics kind of bad for the sport? And they kind of actually said yes. But then obviously kind of the big questions that people were really interested in was like, and who's the MVP? Also, who did they think was going to win the title? But then a couple of questions where it was most underrated and most overrated. Now, in fairness, some of those there weren't as many players that answered, so that changes it a little bit. But they picked Cade Cunningham as most underrated, and
Mm-hmm.
they picked Tyrese Halliburton as most overrated.
Okay.
They asked him about that after the game. Obviously, he doesn't care because, again, he's coming off of 2 wins, and he played very well in game two,
Yes.
and helped lead them in game one. Didn't score a lot, but, did set up and run their offense. But these are always really fun, because like we talk about this at the beginning of the season where it's like the GM survey where they ask everybody like, who's the best player, who's the best team, and all these other questions. And it's always kind of funny because, you can kind of see the difference in how maybe players view the game versus say like front office people, certainly other fans and analysts and media people. So it was kind of a fun read. It's on The Athletic if you want to read it. I don't think that one is paywalled, I don't think, because
Yeah.
I was able to see it without having to do anything.
Yeah, go check it out. It's actually pretty like you said insightful, and I think I can understand why the answers are the way they are, especially like with the underrated and overrated thing, and even like the MVP one. I think Shea won that one, if
Yeah,
I'm not
he did.
mistaken. So
He
I
did.
do understand all those things, and I think there are valid points to them.
Yeah. Also another story John Horst, the GM for the Bucks, right? They reached a new deal with him, an extension, and the ownership and him reached, like a multi-year deal, and kind of interesting, right? Just because of the situation that the Bucks were in, right? Obviously, the last few years, some of the moves they've made, the situations they've been in, firing the coach, changing the roster, it's a lot of different things, right? So obviously, there's I think also been some questions about like some of these decisions maybe they were made at the behest of others, right? That's also kind of some of the reporting that came out of it. But obviously for the Bucks, I guess, it provides some front office stability. But, and it's not a new person. So maybe you're not in the mode of like, oh, that means everybody's gonna go. But I still think the question is assuming they go out early, what is gonna happen? Because I would have a hard time thinking that they're gonna have the same roster, but at the same time, you're almost out of chess moves. You just don't really have a whole lot left to really move because you don't have young players, on reasonable deals that some teams might like. You don't have a lot of vets that probably other teams would necessarily want. And, you don't have a lot of like mid-range contracts to move either, right? That
Yeah.
really provide any sort of value. So I feel like he's got some work cut out for him, and I don't really know where this is going to lead to. Because like to his credit, they've made some big moves. It's not like they haven't done anything. It's just some of the moves ended up not working out. Like even the Lillard one, like you can't really fault them for doing the trade. It's just the problem is filling out the rest of the roster is they couldn't really do, and it's not as feasible now with the new CBA. And now the Middleton trade for Kuzma just feels like it just hasn't worked out because Kuzma just hasn't been good enough, I think, to warrant it. But at the same time, Middleton had injury issues, so it probably felt like it was time to move on, but you just didn't get a great return because it just feels like he's been kind of a disappointment. He was
He's been
better in
horrible.
game two, but the bar was low because, I mean, he did literally nothing in game one.
Yeah, he put up a big fat 0 in game 1, and I think this contractual agreement or whatever, I think it concerns me because I haven't seen a whole lot of great decision making. I think post title for the Milwaukee Bucks, and granted, I mean their hands were kind of tied in some situations, and I think at the end of the day, if that Damian Lillard move does become available, I think you have to pull the trigger on that 10 times out of 10. Like I'm not saying don't do that, but I think it was the follow up things and the follow up moves and the lack of them actually post Dame trade. You just never really put elite personnel that makes Damian Lillard and Giannis, an even better duo because that
Mhm.
those two guys can only take you but so far. I think at the end of the day, basketball still is a team collective game, and they just haven't really put the greatest of personnel around those guys, and that's why it's kind of a head scratcher to me why you would extend a guy who has not maximized, I think the roster to its best capabilities, and I don't know, it's weird, but who knows? He might have like some weird trick up his sleeve.
Yeah. And then also, we did have some other awards that were announced, right? Because obviously, as we were recording, they announced Mobley was Defensive Player of the Year, but they'd also announced previously Jalen Brunson Clutch Player of the Year, which was an award that I think we just didn't even put in
Yeah.
our awards episode. And then also Peyton Pritchard was Sixth Man of the Year.
Yep. Um, the whole clutch player of the year thing. Our logic is, I mean, it's a very hard award, I think, to gauge because it depends on how you look at it. But also, is there even really a point of that award? I would prefer maybe offensive player of the year and defensive player of the year, kind of like how the NFL does it. But that's neither here nor there. But with the I guess, with the Peyton Pritchard thing, I believe that was my pick for sixth man of the year. I think it's very well deserved. The guy is crazy efficient off the bench. He would be a starter anywhere else, in the league. And I think it's pretty special, to see and have a guy like him come off the bench and pretty much give you instant offense and be a commanding force like that. Well
He
deserved.
can, yeah, and his progression may help make Boston, you know, I don't know if they'll be as good as they were last year
Hmm.
because the league is also better, but
Hmm.
like certainly it's another guy you can turn to.
Yeah,
And now he's held up defensively better than he did, as a rookie,
I agree.
which is also what you want to see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then now to close things out, we also had another poll that we had on IG, and the question was the best game one so far. This was put out, before our last episode that was covering all the game ones. 50% of responses said Warriors Rockets, and then 30% said Nuggets Clippers, and then 20% said Lakers Wolves. I would probably put Nuggets Clippers game 1 ahead of Warriors Rockets, but again, it was a competitive game, for stretches. I mean, it went up, the Warriors went up by 20, but the Rockets did fight back. But, I feel like some combination of those three, 0% said Knicks Pistons. So like none of the other ones really got any bump at all. And like in fairness, some of those were blowouts. Like you're not going to have OKC Memphis game 1 as the best game
No.
1, or anything like that. But I don't disagree too much with the list. Like I said, I would just put Nuggets Clippers, I think, ahead of Warriors Rockets. And Warriors Rockets probably ahead of Lakers Wolves, because that one was a beatdown, for most of the game, other than I guess the first quarter.
Yeah, I think there's, validity to all four of the options for sure. Like you could say, the Knicks 20-0 run was pretty special, in terms of what they were able to do and make a very good fourth quarter comeback. You could say, the Minnesota Timberwolves pretty much, squashing a lot of the noise before the game pretty much, or, after the first quarter, that could be, a contender, I guess. But for me, I would say Warriors Rockets just because of the Steph factor. There was a lot of hype going into that series. Definitely, one of the most hyped, series along with Nuggets Clippers. And I think, the shots that Steph was hitting were just ridiculous. And I think that alone kind of pushes that one a little bit ahead of the Nuggets Clippers one, even though the Nuggets Clippers game was phenomenal as well.
And that's a fair
Yeah.
point too, because like you said, in game 1 of Nuggets Clippers, you didn't get, like you said, the same level of shot making, even though it was back and forth. Like Harden had a great game 1,
Mm-hmm.
but you didn't get the Kawhi shootout in game 1.
Mm-hmm.
And Jokic had a decent game. But, like you said, the Steph performance in game 1 was probably the best performance from anybody in any of these game 1s,
Yeah.
aside from, I guess, whomever else you'd put in there.
Yep.
But I think his was definitely the best one. So from that perspective, I think that's why, like I said, I don't really have an issue with the poll. Like I think the order is fine.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts on these series so far after going through the first 2 games. Now we're headed to the road for the second half, I guess, of these series potentially. We'll see where these matchups go from here. Obviously, the live streams will continue once these series end. We'll see what happens with our schedule. So, we can't promise everything, but we'll try to do what we can. And of course, if you want to join in on these Instagram polls, we put them up so you can always vote and you can join in and we'll read the responses, and kind of see what it looks like. Continue to leave comments on our videos or our other socials. And also don't forget to like and subscribe to help the channel grow. We appreciate you watching. We'll see you next episode.